So I saw this great piece of research from Rand and SparkToro, where Rand published all this data about tons of actual Google search queries and uncovering a load of insights that I just haven't seen from anywhere before. I was curious though, because there were a couple of takeaways that I had a different perspective on, and I wanted to share those in the interest of conversation and discussion, and also just to hear from other folks and see what you made of this data, and perhaps to encourage us all to think in a curious way when we see this kind of data published and think about what we can learn from it. So I pulled out this particular chart from Rand's research, and what we're seeing here is along the x-axis are the number of searches per query. So this is massive queries with 100,000 plus searches, all the way down to queries that only have a couple of hundred searches in the 21 months that the data is from. And the blue is the number of keywords in each bucket. I think we can ignore that for the purpose of what I'm talking about here. I'm more interested in this pink line, which is the total search demand per bucket. And this is definitely interesting at the head, which is the insight that Rand is taking away from this, that just 150 query terms make up 15% of all search demand here, which is quite spectacular. I'll talk about a couple of caveats in a second, but I was more interested in the way that this seems fairly flat across these buckets. The pink line is fairly flat. And that shows, at first glance, maybe some of the long tail effect that we've been used to thinking of, that a lot of the query volume is captured in the low individual query volume search queries. Was it kind of challenging that? But what I realized was that these buckets are not equally sized. So this one covers everything from 50,000 to 100,000, which is obviously a span of 50,000 range, whereas this one's only 250 different search query volume increments. So what I did first of all was just take all of the data that's in this chart and dump it individually into a table. I've highlighted a couple of things in pink that I want to kind of call out here. So most of the purple up to the total searches is just straight off the chart. I had to estimate a top end of the 100K plus bucket because that's just open-ended at the top end. So I picked 500,000. That's could be too high or too low. It's worth noting that the searches per keyword in this bucket is in the 300,000s. So it's certainly not wild to think that it's going to be, it's certainly not 1 to 200,000. So somewhere up to 500,000 seems sensible. And what we see is that these buckets vary hugely in size, from the tens or even hundreds of thousands down to the single-digit hundreds. And I made up this metric of my own of the search volume density, which is just a way of saying I don't have the breakdown of the individual data points within this. But if I was going to estimate how many of the queries that fall in the 50 to 100K range actually fall in the 50 to 51K range, I would use the density. So basically the searches divided by the size of the bucket. And out of that, I can plot my estimate of what that same chart looks like when we make all of the buckets the size of the smallest bucket. So there's 250 across. And the chart looks very different. Instead of that fairly flat line that we were looking at, we see what I was expecting, much more of this concentration in the long tail of an awful lot of the query volume aggregating into low individual query volume search queries. And you might think that some of those huge queries would show up somewhere in here. But actually, if we plot it again with a line showing the maximum, this is the average query volume among those top 150, whatever, crazy high volume search queries, it almost doesn't show up on this chart. So I think this is just an interestingly different perspective on exactly the same data. What I'm hoping here is that we can tease out some of this curiosity, tell the different stories, and learn interesting lessons from it. The one other caveat I wanted to throw in here is that this is not exactly the full long tail either, because as Rand calls out from the data source, he says, for a variety of reasons, that queries are limited to only those with more than 100 searches over the 21-month period. And that's quite significant, because if this extreme bias towards the long tail holds true completely, there are going to be a ton of queries that are only searched 5 times, once a month, even once across the entire search period across the 21 months. And so if we had the full data, we might expect to see an even more skewed view. But for my purposes, what was interesting to me was just being able to reformat this data and look at it with equal-sized buckets of query demand and see that the long tail effect is definitely still there to see.